The Federal Archives, as you know, ladies and gentlemen, is part of the administration. So the perspective of this presentation is halfway between practice and science. It will be rather descriptive. I have to admit that now, after testing our hypothesis, we would have chosen another title because we didn't find information pertaining to digital visions. However, we did find sources documenting how techniques should produce more efficient workflows in the administration. We come back to that. So here, the setup of my presentation. The core will be a sort of a comparison of the data processing between 1960s and 1980s. I call this assessment 1 and assessment 2. And in between will be sort of a lookout, a small vision of the Zentralstelle. The Zentralstelle ist die Zentralstelle für Organisationsfragen für die Bundesverwaltung. We have heard about it yesterday. It's the central office for organizational matters in the federal administration. It was responsible for data processing in the administration. I will call it Zentralstelle throughout this presentation. So the issue is the development of data processing in the federal administration between 1960 and 1980. And the hypothesis is the question or the idea that in the 1960s and 1970s, data processing is primarily an instrument for the operationalization of administrative processes. Operationalization is sort of building a bridge from a concept to tasks. In our case, transforming strategic directives into concrete processes or workflows. It's quite funny that we didn't talk about terms until now. I will try to do that shortly, because talking about terms, we have to differentiate terms used in the 1960s from concepts we use nowadays. In the 1960s, data processing is the collection and management of information objects. When data, numbers, text, and others are processed largely automatically by a machine on a given program, we speak of automatic data processing. The term ICT we use nowadays was not used then. Its use today stresses the role of unified communication and the integration of hardware and software. So, in order to enable users to access, to store, to transmit, and to manipulate information. In this presentation, I will use the term data processing. The initial situation is very interesting because it will be a film. I would like to show you a film from the Filmwochenschau. It's a short film to data processing in the early 1960s. The film shows one of the biggest calculating machines operating in Europe, the first computer of the Swiss Post. It was set up in 1957.
Die komplizierten Rechnungen, die hier angestellt werden, sind ein Teil des Arbeitsprogramms für ein Elektronengehirn. Wir sind auf der Lochkartenzentrale der PTT in Zürich. die vor kurzem einen der größten in Europa installierten Rechenautomaten in Betrieb genommen hat. Durch sorgfältige Kontrollen gilt es hier, eine beinahe unübersehbare Zahl von Kontakten in Ordnung zu halten und ein Regiment von Elektronenröhren zu überwachen. Das Gedächtnis der Maschine ist eine Magnettrommel. Die Aufgaben, die der Automat lösen soll, müssen auf Lochkarten eingetragen werden. Das Elektronengehirn kann nur Probleme bewältigen, die menschliche Intelligenz logisch durchdacht und vorbereitet hat. Ist es einmal soweit, rechnet die Maschine verblüffend schnell. Eine Addition in einer Tausendstelsekunde, eine Multiplikation in einer Hundertstelsekunde. Die Magnettrommel gibt die gespeicherten Programmimpulse ab, die Resultate werden auf Karten gelocht. Ein künstliches Gehirn? Nein, eine Hilfe im Kampf gegen den Personalmangel. Ein Beispiel, die Lohnabrechnungen des gesamten schweizerischen PTT-Personals werden in 2,5 Stunden erledigt.
2 points in the rhetoric of the spokesman are very interesting. He says first that the electronic brain can only handle problems that have been thought and planned by human intelligence. Second, he stresses that the purpose for using the machine is not about developing artificial intelligence, but only as a measure against staff shortages. We shall believe him and say that the focus is on efficiency. So let's come to the first assessment, that is the situation of data processing in the early 1960s. There were about 3 big data centers in the administration. The first one was in the Federal Statistical Office. They had an IBM machine. Then there was the data center in the ETH. They had 3 big computers. The military department data center had 2. And 3 others were working in the social security, in customs, and taxes. So it was about 10 machines running for the government. What were the disadvantages of data processing systems? First of all, large efforts had to be done preparing the application. Then it is a rigid system. There is no flexibility. And they are very expensive. So they create staff problems because the experts that could operate these machines were rare. And data collection and manipulation is very costly because labor intensive. But there are also advantages of data processing systems. You have a great speed in performing the operations once they are prepared. Then you have more comprehensive analysis with little additional effort. You have print-ready tables, as the Zentralstelle was stressing. You have easy and space-saving archiving. So the result of all these advantages is, everybody says, more efficiency, but only if data processing is correctly used. So let's come to sort of a vision. It is a lookout of the Zentralstelle that was responsible for data processing in the federal administration. Their concept of future of the future data processing. The premises of this is that they say that data processing technology is always ahead. And they also say that not all applications are predictable. And they think that electronic processing is suitable for computational task fulfilling conditions. And these conditions are quite interesting. The work must be described exactly and logically. It must have a certain minimum volume, and it should have a certain routine character. Then there are also conditions if this should go well, and the Zentralstelle stresses that the support of the governing bodies is absolutely necessary. And this I find very interesting. They said managing methods must be adjusted. Planning must be accurate and full, and there can't be any short-term changes of rules and workflows. So that's a very important condition, and this in a way is really visionary, because if you read it net and clear, it says that the technique is going to bind men. If you want to run it successfully, you have to adjust to the technique. So the other conditions like enough suitable staff, more training and so on is secondary to that. But this was so important that the Zentralstelle already in 1961 published an instruction. It was the instruction number 1, how to plan data processing in the administration. What sort of tools or applications the Zentralstelle thought of? Here, the most listed or mentioned applications for data processing systems. In general, this was for accounting, it was for register management, documentation, archiving, and there were also special applications, especially for the military, that is air defense, and certainly also statistics. So let's come to the assessment number 2, so to the situation in the late 1970s. In 1978, there were 47 computers working in the administration. They were operated by 685 people. The machinery was worth 195 million Swiss francs, and the operative costs and expenses were really very high, 115 million Swiss francs. So the Zentralstelle in its lookout was quite right. It is expensive. The situation in the late 1970s was somehow strange, because the Zentralstelle, an office in the Federal Chancellery, was responsible for the strategy of that data processing and for the planning. But they didn't run the computers. The computers were run by the Federal Office of Statistics. And I don't know what you think if this could really work in the long run. Two different offices in two different departments. The situation was quite difficult. This gap was going to be a problem. The statistical office, I mentioned it, still functions as a data center for the federal government. Now they have 3 computers running, IBM machines, and they do accounting and other administrative calculation for 33 different government offices. 1980, there was a new law that stressed the responsibility for data processing in the Zentralstelle. And the Zentralstelle at that time was upgraded into the Federal Office for Organization. And this office, the Federal Office for Organization, is the future Federal Office of Information and Technology. So that brings me to the conclusion of my intervention. The concept of the Zentralstelle for data processing in the early 1960s was sort of visionary. They saw that there will be various emerging possible applications, and really the computers running in the federal administrations were quadrupling in 20 years. They also saw that all in all advantages were bigger than disadvantages. They saw that it was expensive, labor-intensive and costly. And they saw that it was efficient if correctly used. But, as I mentioned in the beginning of my intervention, this data processing concept didn't correspond to a real digital vision, but rather aimed at solving problems for the following task. I mentioned before, it worked administrative tasks in more than 30 government offices. So it seems to me that this is one important path for the development of ICT in the federal administration to compute certain administrative tasks. Then there were two different paths, like for the military, they needed this technique for air defense, but that was really another path. And there was also a scientific path, for instance in the ETH, but also for the statistics. So all in all, as I said in the beginning, the title of my presentation here is somewhat wrong, because at the end, in the 1960s and 1980s, data processing was an instrument for the operationalization of administrative processes, and that was in the focus of the data processing concept in the 1960s and 70s. Thank you very much.